Hey everyone, it's Scott from Heroic Studios Gaming coming at you with another video. Today is an RPG review where I talk about something cool that I like, something that affected me. Today I'm going to be telling you, in preparation for Indigenous Peoples Days, I'm going to be talking about Coyote and Crow, which was made in 2021 and went to Kickstarter in 2021, and afterwards the people who made it decided to start the company called Coyote and Crow LLC, which is based on the game, because the Kickstarter did so freaking well that they had a decent amount of money to be able to use to make an LLC, very similarly in fashion to mine. It's created by Connor Alexander, Derek Pounds, William McKay, Coyote Oldbear, and has additional writing from Nico Alberts and Rihanna Elliott. These are all peoples of indigenous descent who are also in the spectrum of LGBTQ. Well, many of them are in the, not all of them, we'll leave that caveat, in the spectrum of LGBTQIA peoples or two-spirited peoples, which is a complex concept, and you'll want to look into that if you really don't understand. But the publisher Coyote & Crow LLC was founded in 2021 after their successful Kickstarter that raised something like $1 million. Had 16,000 backers, 16,269 backers if I remember correctly. I was one of them, and I was one of the people that backed at the 2-book level, meaning that one of the books came to me, as you see here, and then the other one got donated to Reservation for tabletop role players who are of Native descent that live on reservations. I was super happy to do that. Connor Alexander is a person who started managing Game Shop in 2014. That grew into getting hired by Publishing Services Inc., which is a publisher and distributor of tabletop RPGs, and from there began developing them. Like this one, started developing them in 2018. I think that's when this one was started, and then was eventually sent to Kickstarter 3 years later in 2021. Very similar story to me, just 1 year off. He's a member of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. He was born in California, much like me, and is currently living in Seattle. I live in Portland. Very similar, though I have the very, very, very small 2%, very small Native heritage in my bloodline. My grandfather has more, but that's a different story. So this game is a futuristic, semi-cyberpunk, mostly science fiction tabletop RPG that takes place in an alternate future where a meteor hit the ground sometime in the early 2000s or early 1400s, not 2000s, early 1400s, and it caused a snap ice age, as you'd expect a meteor to do when it crashes and sends dust up into the sky, creating cloud coverage and whatnot. This meant that the world got covered in this sort of ice sheet that kept the peoples of Europe from essentially colonizing the rest of the world. Columbus couldn't sail the ocean blue in 1492 if there was no ocean blue to be sailed in 1492. Completely makes sense. So in this book, this alternate reality, the peoples of America and throughout the rest of the world, though they have stated that might come out in later supplements if they can find peoples of those locations to be able to write stuff. Like, they're not going to write about India. They are not from India. They're not going to write about Africa because they're not from Africa. But if anyone who's from those places wants to write the alternate history of what those places would look like, they invite them to do so and be part of a supplement for the future. They said that that's their plan, and I believe them. They do have other supplements coming out right now, which are more adventurous. It's actually Kickstarter right now. Not Kickstarter, sorry. It's a backer kit, but same difference. Right now for more stories in the world that they created here. But essentially, when the Awis happened, the Darkening Land, the peoples of the Americas and the rest of the world changed, and their development was different. They changed as a group, and they evolved culturally, technically, spiritually, especially with the loss of the Great Spirit, and so they had to create their own sort of different followings and trappings in North America, which they call Makasing, and they developed a sort of mutual group, which I will cover a little bit more when we talk about whether or not you can approach this game as a non-native person. But many of the trappings of European culture are not here in Makasing. There's no Gregorian calendar, so they have a different system for tracking time. There's no culturally embedded shame over nudity or sexuality. There's no mass wheat production, no mass meat production, no fossil fuels, no combustion engines, no gunpowder, and no farming of things like cows, pigs, and chickens, because those were all things that were brought over. No coffee, because that would have been something that was imported, and no alcoholic beverages, though alcohol does exist as like a cleaning agent, sterilizing agent, but not as like a thing that people consume, because that would affect their bodies in ways that they don't necessarily want to be affected. But suffice it to say, there's no history. There's some history about like war and starvation because of the Awes, but there's no history of like slavery and disease that were part of the European colonization of America. There's instead this thing where everyone sort of developed differently, and then as the Ice Age began to melt, they began to discover things like this purple mark, which they called the Adenati, and that was something that they realized they could harness for power. So engineers, scientists, and spiritual leaders all sort of focus on the Adenati because it gives them the ability to do cool things that are very science fiction-like. So there's wind, solar technology, hydro technology, hover technology, 3D printers, augmented reality, personal computers, cellular telecommunications, the internet, and things like that do exist because of this sort of alternate power system and this alternate system of development. But they would just look different than the way that we currently have them today. You wouldn't have iPhones, for example, because Apple was never a company that existed, right? But there's also this idea that if you wanted to bring in some of the trappings of typical Western science fiction, like nuclear fission or nanotechnology, you can easily pull that in because it's your game, so homebrew however the hell you want, peoples. But it is 710 years since the Awis, since the Darkening Land, and the peoples have changed because of that, and we live in this sort of alternate world, and 710 would be sometime slightly in the future from where we are now, but basically pretty close. Alternately, though, because development was different. So that is the setting of Coyote and Crow. There's a whole bit in here about the alternate path of development for the native peoples that sort of creates a fictional sort of language and heritage for everyone to embrace. Which is what I'll cover in a second. But that also means that they cover things like economy, justice and law, music, art, and religion in this book for this alternate fictional development of the peoples of Makasing. So, a question that would be on everyone's mind for this game. Can you play this game as a person who is not of indigenous heritage? The answer is yes, absolutely. So, in fact, they expressly state that even if you don't have Native American heritage, you should be able to play this game. There's a few caveats, but they also have caveats for native peoples who are playing this game. Like some bits of like, yes, we appreciate your native heritage, but also remember that this has got these alternate things, right? But they also have some caveats that are like, if you're playing with non-native peoples, you can use your tribal affiliations. We love you too, but also recognize that you probably are going to want to explain them to the non-native peoples at your game table, and hopefully you'll have a good time explaining your history and culture and language to the people, and hopefully they're cool enough to want to learn. But the caveat for us non-natives to play this game is that, one, don't use real-world tribal affiliations or First Nation people's heritage. Just don't do it. It's easy enough. You don't have one, so you don't understand it, so therefore use the fictional ones that we've created. And it's not fictional tribes. They have this path system, which I'll cover in a second. But just don't use real world tribal affiliations. Don't incorporate real world First Nations indigenous beliefs into your character's history. Don't use the two-spirited identity because you probably don't understand it. It isn't quite like you think it is. Don't use the words from the indigenous language. In fact, they created a whole new language that's like the common tongue of the peoples of this world, the common language if you're playing D&D. So just use that language, and that's fictional, so everyone can use it. You're all going to be these people who learned it, and it's not your family's native language necessarily. Everyone uses it, so everyone can just use it, and so you can use these words. And they have a whole thing on their website about how to use it. It's called Chahi. And so just go use that language, and do not, whatever you do not mimic the stereotypical fashions that you think Native Americans or that you see in films, the way that Native Americans or indigenous peoples act or talk. Just don't do it. If you can respect those things and give respect to those peoples, then you can absolutely play this game. Those seem fine to me. Those are easy rules for me to follow. I'm like, sure, yeah, I won't try to pretend to be something else. That sounds fine. So that's how they set that up. So they do this, like I said, this alternate sort of history thing and the alternate economy, justice, law, music, religion. And so you can just, as a non-native person, accept those wholesale and move forward, and just recognize that these fictional aspects are the things you're supposed to lean into and not like real world aspects. And then they said, what was it? It said there's a warning for the religious side and says, like, hey, listen, you probably have unconscious biases. They don't actually say the phrase unconscious bias. That's me saying the phrase. They just sort of explain you probably don't understand them, or you're probably looking at them with this particular filter. So what unconscious bias is. So don't try to relate them to Roman polytheism or Christian beliefs. If you want to try to understand them, look into animism, dualism versus materialism, or spiritualism. But it's probably best if you just approach it with a sort of play your character as a character who's just atheistic and has science-based practices rather than sort of the more spiritual practices, and probably participates in the festivals and traditions of the group as a whole, but in the same way that most people nowadays would approach any holiday and not truly understand its origins, right? It's the same kind of thing, or care about its origins, right? Like trying to have a Christian person try to explain to you why a Jewish holiday is practiced in Christianity is probably a bit hard to do, and so they're like, yeah, just go with it. So that's what they said. So there's a way to play this game as a non-native person. I think it's great. I think to have this fictional thing is great. And like I said, paths. I didn't cover that. So there's when you make your character, you actually choose these paths for your character, and these paths link you or bind you to an animal. And that animal binding does sort of help you out. It gives you an ability when you make your character. You get just like a special ability that you get from your path, but then it also benefits 2 stats. And so these paths are kind of like your character's like class in other games, right? But these paths work as sort of these sort of tribes, or not tribes, clans or groups that you lean into more so than you would your heritage for any reason. You're just leaning into these things, and so therefore it makes it easy for you to play a character in this game that doesn't have a tribal affiliation, because it doesn't matter, as you have one of these paths, so you lean into those paths, and you will have like friendliness with other paths of the eagle, for example, or paths of the bison peoples than you would necessarily with members of your own tribal affiliation. So just lean into those, and that gives you this completely great way to play as a non-native person in this world. I love it. That's wonderful. So it makes me it's approachable for me. But let's talk about character creation. So when you go to make your character, you're essentially going to choose a couple of things up front, and then you're going to assign build points to build your character. And there's a whole chart on how much points cost. I'll cover that in a second. But you're essentially going to choose the motivation for your character, and it's going to be things like acceptance, curiosity, family, honor, power, love, wealth, status, etc. There's a whole list of them. You choose that as your motivation, and that's like the thing that motivates your character to be adventurous, to be going out and checking out moccasing or trying to trade with other peoples. Then you choose an archetype, which isn't actually like a class. It's more like the role that you generally play. No one really says, oh, you're a warrior. They have like the key roles, like the groups that would be in there. So like a trail guard would be like a warrior, for example, and that might be what you're called, like, oh, I'm a trail guard or whatever. But you're essentially warrior, scout, tinker, seeker, healer. There's a bunch of those. And so you choose those sort of things, and that sort of just helps you figure out how you're building your character. Like if everyone's playing warriors, then you're obviously going to be a semi-combat oriented group. And that sort of thing. And so it just helps you choose how to do your stats and stuff, and how the other players might recognize that there might be multiple people of the same sort of type at the table. Then you're going to choose some identifiers, like your age, your gender, your sexuality, things like that. They have no mechanical benefit. They're just things that you know about your character that help you to be able to roleplay the character. And then you choose the path. And the path is when you start actually making your character, where you choose, I'm going to choose the path of the eagle, or path of the coyote, or path of the fox. And that's going to give you 2 benefits to a stat and a special ability when you get to the point in character creation where you get to choose special abilities. So that's how you do that. But when it comes to actually making your stats and your skills and your gifts or burdens, and gifts or burdens are sort of like advantages or flaws in other games. If you play Shadowrun, you have advantages and flaws. That's what gifts or burdens are. They're not like feats. The abilities are more like feats in, say, Dungeons and Dragons. And so these are more like just like situations where like maybe you have family status, or maybe you have, whatever, you're a known scientist. Maybe you have a lot of money. Right. So these kinds of gifts or burdens do exist, and they're like advantages or flaws. If you have a higher wealth, for example, then you're going to be able to buy more things without having to make rolls to see if you can obtain them. If you have debt because of the same wealth thing, if you have debt, then you owe somebody money, and so whenever you make some wealth, you have to turn it over to somebody until you can work off that burden. But you get 42 points to spend on stats and 42 points to spend on skills, and it doesn't say you have to do them in any way. Just because you're a Path of the Eagle doesn't mean you have to spend any of the points related to these stats that come from being the Path of the Eagle. You just can freely spend them, and the cost is relatively easy. There's a table that explains it, but the cost is actually relatively easy to figure out once you've looked at it and sort of paid attention, and you've done it a couple of times. You go, oh, this makes sense. For stats, everything starts at 1, so that costs you no build points, right? No character points. But if you go to 2, then it's going to be the current one plus the previous one. So 2 will cost you 3 points, right? 1 plus 2. Very simple. 3 ranks in a stat will cost you 3 plus the 3 you spent for 2, so 6. very simple. It's what you've spent so far, and then for the one before, and then the additional one. So like 4 would be 10, right? Because it would be you've spent 6 for 3, and 4 for the 4, so 10. Very simple system for choosing your stats. Really not complicated. The skills are very similar, but they're slightly different. The skills all start at 0. So 1 in a skill will actually cost you 1 point. So it's a little bit of a different thing. There are 9 stats, so the stats will be a little bit higher, probably than on average than your 28 skills. So the rank 1 costs 0 point, or rank 0 costs 0 points. Rank 1 costs 1 point. Rank 2 costs 3 points, etc. So it goes on the normal path, except that it doesn't start at 1; it starts at 0, and so it's exactly the same. And what you'll do, I'll cover in a minute with that. So you just remember that you buy those things. The 9 stats are separated into power, finesse, and reserve on one side of the chart, and then physical, mental, and spiritual on the other side of the chart. So there's going to be like a physical power, a mental power, a spiritual power, or a physical finesse, a physical suddenly can't think of it all of a sudden. Physical reserve, yeah, that one. So like that. So it's just going to have these 9 stats that are broken down that way. And then after you have all your stats done, you're going to calculate the derived stats, which includes your physical, it's your physical defense, your mental defense, your spirit defense, which are things that are going to be rolled whenever, or used as the success numbers for whenever anyone tries to punch you or try to change your mind or try to attack you spiritually, that kind of thing. And then you also will create pools based off of that, and those are called body, mind, and soul, which are used for essentially your HP. Your body pool is your physical HP. Your mind pool is your mental HP, and your soul pool is your spiritual HP. And then mind, body obviously makes sense. You get stabbed, that's going to come out of your body, but your spirit your mind and soul, those are going to be more like social interactions or interactions with spiritual things. For example, in a social interaction, you're going to try to convince someone to do a thing. You will try to win that, and if you lose, then you lose a mind point, right? If you fail to convince them, you lose a mind point. You've lost some of your mental HP. And then if you do an opposed challenge with somebody, if you guys are trying to show off with each other or try to convince someone of something and you're opposing each other, then you will also lose a soul if you fail. It's like that. But those pools are also used to activate special abilities. So the abilities will require some point of your pools. And then also focus, which I'll get into when I talk about the dice rolling system. Focus will also cost you a mind point to use. So how does the system work? Now that I've covered how to make your character and I've explained that these things exist, how does it work? It's actually very simple. It's a D12 dice pool system. And I had to make a bunch of notes to really follow because this is actually kind of where it gets a little complicated. The game essentially uses a dice pool system, a D12 dice pool system, and you're essentially just going to build a pool of dice, of D12s, based on, for the most part, but not in every case, a skill plus a stat. In some cases, it might be stat plus a stat, if you're, trying to jump over a large building, stat plus a stat, and then if it's a resistance, like if you're being attacked by something, it's probably just going to be the stat, and that's what you roll. So that's how that works. But when it's a stat plus skill, you're going to take the dice pool, you're going to build your dice pool, and then you're going to try to roll them. And there's going to be a required success number. There's like a dual system for determining whether or not you get to count successes. And that is that the success number is set as a difficulty. By default, it's 8, but certain situations or conditions or maybe your abilities will lower or increase that number. So maybe it's a 9 because it's complicated. Like, for example, for hacking a computer system, it's probably going to be 9 because 8 would be the default, but it's a little bit complicated because you're trying to hack a system. So 9 is the number on the die you need to get a success. So if you get 9 or above or 8 or above, you get a success, and that counts. And then you have the dice that don't get that number are not failures. They just don't do anything. They just didn't give you any benefit whatsoever. They just exist. And then if you roll a 1 on any of those dice, that's a failure. So that's how that works. To determine overall success, you have to determine if you have 1 or more successes over any failures. So if you have at least 1 success overall, then you succeeded in the action. If you have no successes because none of your dice reached that success number because either it was too high or you just rolled really badly, then that's just a failure. Nothing happens. You just didn't achieve the action you were trying to do. And if you have less than 0 failures or less than 0 successes, which can only occur with those ones that I was talking about before, then it's a critical failure. So say, for example, you were to roll 5 dice and none of the dice were 8 or above. But a couple of the dice were 1s. So having no successes, your 1s have become below 0 successes because when you get a 1, you minus a success. If you have no successes, then it's a negative success. That would be a critical failure, and a critical failure results in something crazy happening. There's some other parts which require the notes for determining whether or not you succeeded overall. Firstly, you roll those dice. If the dice get a 12, then you add an additional die to your group. It's called a critical die. It doesn't have 1s on it. It just rolls. And if it is above the success number, that counts as 2 successes. If it rolls below the success number, then it's 1 success. So either way, the critical die is going to give you at least 1 success. So that's one way to add more successes to your pool. You're not going to need them if you don't have any failures, but you do it anyway to find out just how well you do your thing, because in the case of damage, it is literally the number of successes you have. So you might want them when you're trying to stab somebody or shoot somebody. So that's how that works. But you have ranks of legendary, which don't occur in the beginning, but they do occur as you go through the game. The more story arcs that your character has created, usually like 8 sessions or so, you will gain a legendary rank. And all that means is that you have this legendary rank. People know who you are. You've done some things. And when you go to roll those dice, you can change the number on any of the dice, except for the 1s, by the number of ranks that you have. You can change any dice. You don't have to change 1 dice. You could, if you have 2 ranks of legendary, you can bump a die up 2, or you can bump 2 dice up 1, right? It's up to you, however you want to split that up. But that might mean you can move some of those dice that were not successes into successes because you bumped them up. The other thing you can do is you can use focus, which is essentially your character saying, I'm going to spend some of my mind points to take some of these dice and turn them into successes or raise them up. You're probably not going to use them for anything where it's not going to make it a success, but you can do that. And you can also move them up to 12s, the same with legendary. You can move those up to 12s, thus giving you a critical die. That's fine. The game says, yeah, that's okay. We don't care if you do that. You just can't change 1s. So 1s will always be this problem. So overall, if you have more successes than you have these 1s, then you've succeeded in the action and you did something cool. And then, like I said, for damage and stuff, it's just however many successes you had, that's how much damage you did. There's no benefit from weapons and stuff, just that it allows you to stab somebody. You can punch somebody, if you want to. You can stab them. That's going to be what the knife is for. You can use a mag bow or a mag sling, which is the alternate to guns, and you can use those to do damage to people. It's like that. Very simple system in the end. It just took a minute to get there. It took a couple of minutes according to the tracker on how long this video is, but that's what you do. So when you roll the dice here, I'm going to do an example actually. I'm going to show you. When you roll the dice, you will do stat plus skill plus stat. All the skills are related to 2 stats. There are 2 stats they're related to, and there's a reason for that, because that is how the game determines proficiency. If you have a stat like above, so you have the skill computers, let's say a character is going to be hacking into something, they want to do some programming or something, whatever that is on the computer they're doing, they're going to make the dice roll. So they have 4 on computers, so they're automatically starting with 4 dice, and then they will choose between the 2 related stats, whichever one is higher, because that's what they're going to use. So they have proficiency in it. They have at least 1 rank in the skill, so therefore they're proficient in it, therefore they get to use their highest stats. So if it's linked to intelligence and wisdom like it is right here, then you would obviously choose intelligence, and you would roll 7 dice to succeed, or to try to succeed in the action of doing the programming or hacking or whatever it is. If you had 0 ranks in computers, if the character that we're talking about here has 0 ranks in computers, they're just not proficient in computers, but they want to try it anyway, then they actually have to choose the lower of the 2 linked stats, and that's what stat they're going to use. And because they have no ranks in the thing, that is the number of dice they're going to roll. So in this case, if somebody with no ranks in computers is trying to do the hacking thing, they will roll 2 dice. So they had 7 over here, and they have only 2 over here. That's how the game determines proficiency. If you have any ranks whatsoever in a skill, you get to use the higher stat. If you have no ranks, you have to use the lower stat. Very good. Very simple. But it also means that they had to link all the skills to 2 stats. So when you're looking at them, you can kind of see where your stats lie, which is sort of why your paths kind of matter a little bit. If you're going to be a character who's hacking all the time and you've chosen, I don't know, Path of the Bear or something that has nothing to do with like wisdom or intelligence, I mean, you could do that. That's fine, up to you, because it will just mean that later when you maybe have to do something physical, you are going to be slightly better at that, even if you're not proficient in the skill. But that's up to you. That's how you make your character. There's all these variations on how to do your character. I already talked about health points and damage, so I don't need to get into that. But now we're going to talk about my favorite parts. We're 25 minutes into this video, one of the longest videos I've ever made because it's really a good game. This is the part where the book shines. This is what got me to think absolutely 2 thumbs for this game. That is the character advancement system. It has one of the best character advancement systems I have seen in a long time. And the way that it works is very simple. In most games, you're given XP, and you're like, oh, yeah, just spend the XP. Your character gains the additional skill, or the increases their skill proficiency, or, you know, changes their stat or whatever. And then you just kind of have to explain to your game master how or why that happened. That's fine. But in this game, when you want to up a skill or up a stat or up or gain a new gift or up a gift or up an ability or gain a new ability, you have to spend time. So you would set for skills, you set a short-term goal. For everything else, it's a long-term goal. But you set a short-term goal of increasing your skill or gaining a new skill, and you're like, okay, I want to do this thing. So you will have to do that for a number of sessions equal to the new skill level. So if you want to up your computers, right, to 5, you're going to have to spend 5 sessions working on that character's computer skill, thereby meaning that after 5 game sessions, the game master goes, yeah, you've been working on this for X sessions now, so of course your character's better. But you actually have to try to work on it. You can't be like, oh, I was out in the forest camping for 5 sessions and I'm suddenly better at computers. Like, you have to be like, you have to show that your character's putting effort into trying to get better at computers. But it's a thing that you do. It's like the number of sessions that you're doing indicates that you've done better. Now, if you have a mentor, then that mentor will cut one of those sessions down, so you don't need 5, you need 4, which is totally fine. For long-term goals, for like upping stats and stuff, there's actually either a set number of them for the case of like abilities or gifts, or in the case of stats, it's the new stat number times 2. So it takes twice as long to up stats as it does skills, which absolutely makes sense. But you essentially set it as the goal for your character, and for that number of sessions, your character should be working on that thing, and therefore at the end of that time period, you've increased the stat. That's wonderful. That is great. Don't have to try to explain how the character suddenly went from not being able to use a gun one day to suddenly being able to use the gun the next day. No, for the last, session or so, they were trying to increase their abilities to use the firearms. Therefore, they got better at guns, which isn't firearms, right? It's mag slings, like I said. But yeah, so that's what would happen. Great. So now that we're 27 minutes in, we're near the end of this video, so thank you for sitting through all of this. But I do have a couple of complaints. This game is not perfect. I would love to say that it was perfect, but there's a few things that I was slightly annoyed with, or things that I think are not necessarily great, and there could have been better options or better decisions made when making it. So let's get into that. Firstly, the layout. This is a beautiful layout. Don't get me wrong. They did a great job of, like, there's some textured paper, but it's like the textures are light and not really distracting, so text on textured paper, not a big deal in this case. They did fine, right? So they avoided all of the major fails that I often find in other games, so that's a big thumbs up for them. But something that they did do, and you saw it in that picture there, they used some very large sort of cartoonish text, which looks really great in the PDF version, the digital version of the book. But in the printed version, it's really big. And if this was so that people with weaker eyesight could read the book, then never mind. I don't care. And you go about doing awesome things. But it did, for me, it kind of made me distracted a little bit. Sometimes my mind wandered and I have to come back and reread what I was reading because I kind of got lost in this sort of big bubblish text. But otherwise, like I said, in the PDF format, it looked great. On my Kindle, I was reading just fine. And it's distinctly possible that it was just in the digital format and they didn't really think about what it would look like printed and they just made it that way, in which case, okay, that happened. So that's just a minor complaint that I have. But some of the major complaints that I have is that sometimes in the book, Sometimes, so this is the second one, sometimes the book has, it's trying to show modifiers for particular situations, modifiers that will either modify the dice pool, like increase or decrease the dice pool, or modify the success number on the die needed to succeed. Both of these situations are delineated by the same symbols, plus/minus, right? And so plus/minus. There's no other indicator to determine whether this is affecting a dice pool or a success number on the roll. That's a problem. Simple like D after like the thing like plus or minus 1D would have been really helpful, but it's not there. So sometimes you're not like I had to make sure that I read and double check and make sure that I was understanding where it applied when I was going through it to make sure I understand how to play the game, because it's not just a simple, easy delineation. And I think that for game masters, when you're trying to flip through, somebody's doing a thing and you have to decide how to do it, you're going to need that sort of help. You'll have to read a little bit, which kind of creates a problem. Now, if there's a GM screen, which doesn't exist now, but will eventually exist, the GM screen would probably help that out, probably explain that pretty well. But there isn't a GM screen, so for a GM, you have a hard time figuring that out. On that same note, there's some problems when you're trying to go through the text, trying to find major things. They're not delineated in any way by any kind of like text blocks or kind of like indicators that this is important information. This is the formula needed for things, except for at some of those times, not all of those times, the text is bold. And so you have this bold text and you're like, okay, that's something important, but it's not otherwise delineated. So if I'm flipping through really fast as a game master trying to find a reference to what the physical defense number is, I'm not going to easily find it by flip. Oh, there's the chart, right? Or something. It's like you have to go to the section and try to flip till you see bold text. And that's a bit of a problem. So there is some of that I think could have been a little bit better designed. This is a specific example. I was trying to find wealth because I just was like looking at the gear and I had sort of moved ahead a little bit to see what the gear was so I can understand the setting a little bit. And I realized it kept referencing wealth. So then I had to try to find wealth. There is nothing in the index to indicate where wealth is. So I had to like go back to the start and start reading forward, and eventually found the like one bolded text word of wealth. And that's where I found where it says what wealth is. That's a bit of a thing. Now, next complaint. This book is very thick. It is a very thick book, and I wouldn't throw any of it out, but I think some of it was probably overly written. Some of it could have been simplified quite a bit, and that would have cut pages out without changing the like amount of context or amount of information, right? So there's some bits where it like overly explains a few things, and I'm just gonna say, like, while this complaint is a thing that I'm saying, I am not immune to it. If anyone were to see the original edition of Maximum Apocalypse, they would see that I did the exact same thing, and fortunately I had other developers and playtesters who pointed out to me that, hey, this is maybe a little bit of over explanation. You could probably cut this down and make it a little bit cleaner and clearer, a little simplified, and then less is more. And I think that this book could benefit from a little bit of less is more. Not a lot of it. I'm not telling them to go change everything. There's just some bits that I think could have been a little bit easily more streamlined and therefore been a little bit easier to explain. And on that note, with that, this is my final complaint. The book, the explanation on how to play the game doesn't start until page 264. If you've ever watched any of my videos, you know how much I dislike having to get through a large portion of the book before I start getting into the how to play. I like right at the beginning when I can just sort of flip to like the section that's like, what is this? And it sort of gives me a brief idea on what I'm doing, at least some basic understanding of how the game is played. And I can go, okay, this seems fine. I will buy this book to read into it. But this book is written in such that you basically have to invest in it first, and then you'll be able to figure out how to play. It's 264 pages of stuff, which is cool. It's all good. It's character creation stuff. It's world building stuff, but it all happens before I can find out how to play this game. A simple, like, quick how to play this game real fast at the beginning would have been beneficial. But it's fine. It's there, and so overall, regardless of these things, I'm still giving this game 2 thumbs, regardless of these complaints that I have. So just wanted to make sure that you guys understood I didn't think it was a perfect book, that there are some issues. So if you wanted to at me, understand that I know what you're feeling, and so you can't say, oh, well, you didn't talk about how it's so thick and there's so much going on. I did actually. That is one of my things. But overall, I give it 2 thumbs, and I suggest that you go play it. It's approachable by everyone. It's approachable by people who are of Native American heritage, of indigenous heritage, and also by people who are not of indigenous heritage, right? So this is a great game for everybody. So I will give it 2 thumbs, and after 34 minutes tell you that this was definitely worth the money that you would spend on it, as well as the money that I have already thrown into the new backer kit crowdfunding for their adventures, because I would like more adventurers to run this game in, because one of the only real problem I have with this game is that I don't actually know what adventures I should create for it, because it's still pretty new, and it's also like a world that I'm not entirely sure that I know about, and so therefore, because it's so new, therefore I need help. So I'm down with this whole the 10 new adventures thing. I backed it so that I could get both book 1 and book 2, so 5 in one, 5 in the other. I'm looking forward to that, and I want to have the GM screen. I just probably won't ever get it in physical format, because I generally don't do that for most games. I get the digital format, and then if I need to print out pages, I will. All right, so that's it. So that's my 35 minutes of Coyote and Crow, and I hope, and I'll put this up right here so we can have like a little, the little thumbnail of me doing like this. And there we go. So I can make that the thumbnail for this video. So yeah, everyone, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for sticking through 35 minutes of me rambling about a game. And I hope that you can play Coyote and Crow and have fun in this world that was created by these peoples, for you, for me, for them, for everyone. Thanks.